Some movies aren't all that good, but they still manage to escape with a somewhat favorable opinion. The movie Dragonheart is one such example. I remember seeing it back in the 90s and was pretty entertained. I mean, it's got a big talking dragon, which is by itself a huge draw if you're into the fantasy genre. Right from the opening scene, the medieval setting really comes through. Everything we see, from the characters' outfits, to the building, to the color tone of the film, makes it look like something from a Terry Goodkind book cover. If you're a fan of the fantasy genre, this film would be right up your alley. It's got all the usual tropes of knights, dragons, castles, villages, evil kings, and all sorts of medieval folklore. Other than the visuals, we're introduced to one of the best things about this film: its score. The music from this film is probably one of the few things that has stood the test of time. It still gives you the chills and invokes feelings of sadness and hope. Speaking of the test of time, this film hasn't aged well. Most notably seen in the CGI used for the dragon Draco when he's up close. I guess it looked pretty good back in the day, since it got nominated for an Academy Award, but now it looks like something out of a sci-fi episode. And now that I'm revisiting this film with a more mature perspective, the entire movie feels like something you'd see in a TV series. The action scenes look very low budget, and everything feels very small scale. I used to like this movie way back, but after revisiting it recently, even I have to say it's just average overall. There isn't much plot in this movie, as most of the time is spent developing its characters. The film is seen from the perspective of Bowen, a knight who happens to be the mentor of a young, power-hungry prince by the name of Ianin. He's a stereotypical no-nonsense, tough-as-nails type character, but he has a good heart and just wants to end the cycle of oppression by Ianin's father, the king. His main reason for mentoring Ianin is to hopefully impart to him the ways of the old code, a set of values that the knights of old followed, so that he can become a greater king than his tyrannical father. Ianin, however, unknown to Bowen, is already corrupted with power and spoiled by his authority. He dreams of being a better king than his father, but not in terms of character as Bowen wished, but in terms of material accomplishments. During a rebellion by peasants in which the king is killed, we see his lust for power when he snatches the crown from his father and curses him to die. However, in a Final Destination type accident, he himself is mortally wounded and about to die. The queen takes him to Draco, and out of his past friendship with her people, combined with Ianin's vow to be a gracious king, Draco saves him by binding his heart with his, sealing their fates together. As a result of this, Ianin's life force is bound to Draco's, which gives him immortality as long as the dragon is alive. He's crowned king, but he immediately chucks aside his vow to rule compassionately and becomes even more ruthless than his father. Bowen mistakenly concludes that the dragon's heart has corrupted his former pupil, and he leaves the kingdom disappointed with Ianin and swearing to kill the dragon. The rest of the film mainly consists of Bowen and Draco striking a friendship, and then working together with the peasants to overthrow Ianin and end his reign. Pretty standard medieval stuff, and a simple plot, but the main draw of the film and the best character is Draco, as you'd expect. He's supposedly the last of his kind, and just wants to be worthy enough to earn his place among the stars with his brothers. Sharing his life force with Ianin was his chance to do so that he could bring peace to the region when Ianin becomes a better king. But that goal becomes moot when Ianin turned out evil, and Draco has been living with the guilt of it ever since. He's just looking for redemption after his own pride led him to believe that his heart could change Ianin's. His character arc was the one we rooted for the most, and we actually care about his desire to correct his mistake. His witty conversations with Bowen are the best parts of the film, especially in his standoff with him in his mouth, and I'd say Draco is probably one of the most sophisticated dragons we've ever seen on screen. He's so well-spoken and eloquent that he feels like a philosopher trapped in a dragon's body. He's a smaller dragon, about the size of a private jet compared to Smaug's Boeing 747. Sean Connery's voice acting is on point here, and it's one of the things that makes the character endearing. Bowen, on the other hand, I started out liking his character, but I have a small gripe concerning it. It's still somewhat acceptable that he was oblivious to Ianen's corruption and instead pins it on the dragon, but as we see later in the film, he just becomes a hypocrite. After all that talk about the old code and defending the helpless, he just adds to the oppression of the villagers, albeit indirectly. It seems very out of character that he and Draco could come to the decision to go about extorting gold from the villagers through their fraud. Aren't they struggling enough under Ianen's rule? Draco himself said that when you take from the rich, eventually the poor get the brunt of it when the rich just demand more from them to cover back what was lost. So I guess Bowen decided to just bypass the middlemen and take directly from the poor instead. He effectively becomes a conman extortionist and uses Draco to demand protection money in exchange for not blowing them up. I get that he's jaded from the disappointments of life, but this was just stooping too low. Ianen was generally okay as a villain. His motivations of pride and lust are simple, but the film does a good job of making you hate him as an antagonist, and you can't wait for him to get what's coming. In a chance encounter with Ianen, Bowen eventually realizes that his student was lost from the start, and that Draco's heart bonding wasn't to blame. There's a bit of tonal inconsistency with this scene and one that follows after, because this scene represents the lowest point for Bowen, where he discovers that he was blind to Ianen's true state and that all his lessons were in vain. But then, in the next scene, the tone suddenly shifts to a comical one where Bowen is back to his extortion tactics again, trying to cheat another bunch of villagers. How do you go from this to this in just a short span of time? It's inconsistent with the tone of what just happened, and it should have been a moment where Bowen and Draco follow up on their encounter with Ianen instead. Bowen gets his drive and morals rekindled after Draco brings him to Avalon, where he gets nostalgic after wandering around King Arthur's burial site. They then decide to rally the villagers to take Ianen on. Eventually, they storm the castle together with an army of trained villagers and manage to take over it. Draco, who was captured earlier, decides that they can never be rid of Ianen while he's alive. So he compels a reluctant Bowen to strike his heart, ending both their bond and their lives. When I saw this as a kid, Draco's death was the emotional high point of the film. Combined with the sad score and the voice of Sean Connery going to the stars, it was the emotional payoff the film seemed to earn. Ianen finally got his justice, the kingdom would have a new ruler, and Draco earned his redemption by sacrificing himself. But now, looking on it as an adult, it doesn't really hold up as much. First off, what exactly was Draco's plan to defeat Ianen? It's been 12 years since they were bonded. Surely he would know that Ianen would be alive as long as he is. If his goal was to die, he could have just offed himself or let Bowen kill him much earlier and save all the trouble. But no, for some reason, his plan was to help Bowen in their assault against Ianen and his army, which would lead you to believe that there's a viable solution that doesn't involve Draco dying. And it's odd that he didn't tell Bowen that injuring Ianen would injure him, so that the priest wouldn't have shot him and caused Draco to be captured. Even when Ianen was overthrown later, Draco still decided that he has to die. Couldn't they lock him up instead or something? For Draco to lead an assault on Ianen and then decide that he has to kill himself anyway seems like a poorly thought out plan. Alright, but nitpicking aside, Draco's death still worked, mainly because of the bond between him and Bowen. You feel genuinely sad for Bowen because you know he's truly lost a close companion. And their friendship was believable. Two old cronies who bonded over their belief in an ancient code that's been forgotten. And of course, the accompanying score in the scene can add emotion to anything. Dragonheart is a movie that's still passable for entertainment. You can just put it on and soak in the atmosphere. It's not a deep movie. It deals with issues like corruption and mortality and redemption, but doesn't go too deep into them. It tells a concise story at only an hour and 42 minutes, but it does get a bit distracted with the side plot of Bowen's extortionist adventures. Overall, it's underwhelming in terms of its set and its action sequences. The sword fights are the just swing at each other kind, but then again, you aren't really here for the sword fights. It's the most fun when Draco is around, especially when he's exchanging witty one-liners with Bowen. The side characters, however, were pretty mundane, and I didn't really care about them, especially the priest who kept monologuing in a very unnatural and cartoonish way. He has some Hacksaw Ridge thing going on with his reluctance to kill, but that doesn't go anywhere. They just briefly show it and gloss over it like nothing happened. The acting is rather average, and some of the lines were really quite cheesy, which often takes you out of the movie. It sometimes feels like you're watching a script of a high school play instead. Which brings me back to the point I made at the start. It feels more like a bunch of TV episodes lumped together instead of a big-budget Hollywood movie. It's not as good as I remember it, but it is still pretty rewatchable. It's carried by its nostalgia and its score, as well as being Sean Connery's most popular voice acting gig. It was popular enough to generate a long list of sequels, but I think it's all downhill from here based on what I've seen. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.